Here with me now is my colleague Lucas Schoeppner, who helps manage our investment, stewardship, and engagement activities. Lucas, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Joe.
So Lucas, it's the start of the year, which means for many people it's a time for resolutions and renewed energy towards long-term goals. I know I have to show up to my college reunion at my college weight, so that means no sugar or bad foods for the next 2 months. But many people have resolutions surrounding sustainability, like meatless Mondays, or maybe their own composting journey. So while all these are great things to integrate into our personal lives, we talk here a lot about Wespath, or at Wespath, about the organizational impact regarding sustainability. So related to this, one area I wanted to zero in on today is methane. As someone who works in centers around sustainability, what can you tell us about methane, and why is it important in our element of stewardship work here at Wespath?
Sure. And your own resolution helped prompt me to at least try to get the college reunion started, so baby steps. So I'll tell you about it. To answer simply, there are several main types of greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide, and methane is one of these. And while it naturally occurs in small quantities in the atmosphere, excess methane can have a massive impact on the environment because of how potent it is. Depending on the time frame, methane can be 27 to even 100 times worse for the atmosphere than carbon dioxide when it comes to trapping heat. So you're definitely correct that when you touched on the impact of individuals versus large corporations, in a similar vein, one of the best bang for the buck areas where we can make progress on greenhouse gas emissions today is with methane.
So that's a remarkable figure and an important note about why we would want to focus on methane. Can you tell us a bit about the source of this issue? Where do methane emissions actually come from?
Sure. So let's go back to that slide. Some of the main sources of methane emissions are from the energy sector, as well as from agriculture, where emissions come from things like cattle and rice production. On the oil and gas side, emissions can come from a few areas. That includes things like the deliberate venting of methane during the drilling of a well, releases that occur on purpose as part of controllers and switches in the pipeline or wellhead infrastructure, and unintended leaks and major emissions events known as super emitters. The fortunate thing, though, is that we've already got the technology to stop a lot of this methane pollution. We see this focus on reducing methane emissions from the oil and gas sector as one of the best areas for us to focus on when it comes to engagement on climate change. Now, we know the world is going to continue to rely on oil and gas as we move through the energy transition. But there's an immediate climate benefit to reducing methane emissions, making oil and gas production cleaner. And there's an immediate business impact too, whereby companies reduce their waste of a valuable product.
So what kind of engagement work with companies has Wespath been doing when it comes to methane?
Sure. Well, this is one area where we've seen quite a bit of progress amongst U.S. oil and gas companies in recent years. Wespath has conducted site visits at natural gas companies like EQT to review how they're upgrading their infrastructure to reduce leaks at well pads. Some of these companies are also doing things like switching to electronic valves, which reduce deliberately vented methane. As I mentioned, the return on investment for these upgrades is often quite attractive. After all, the less natural gas you leak, the more you can sell. We've also been engaging with some big names in oil like Chevron, ExxonMobil, and Occidental Petroleum to ensure that they're reducing their emissions too. We encourage Chevron and Occidental Petroleum to evaluate that global shift to a low-carbon future, and after multi-year engagements, both published their first ever climate risk reports. Chevron also created emissions reductions targets and linked those targets to its executive bonus structure and published a standalone report on their methane emissions this past year. We were actually just in a meeting with Chevron this morning where they were talking about some of the pros and cons of when you're going out to that pipeline or wellhead, judging whether you spend the money on monitoring for leaks that might be there or just spending the money on making those upgrades right away that could stop the leaks that might be there. So a lot of interesting trade-offs that are taking place with these companies and the work they're doing on
Absolutely.
methane. An important global standard for measuring and reducing methane emissions is called the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership. We've seen lots of progress recently with U.S. companies like ConocoPhillips, just at the end of last year, and ExxonMobil joining this initiative. We're hoping that Chevron and others are going to follow soon.
So Lucas, where else are you seeing momentum on this issue, and what other engagement levers is Wespath using to encourage methane reduction?
Sure. So interestingly, on the policy side, that's one place where we've seen a lot of movement lately. The regulatory body that is responsible for pipelines in the United States hasn't substantially changed its rules on methane leaks and monitoring in years, unlike the rules in place for oil and gas wellheads themselves. But thanks to insights from some of our partner NGOs, like the Environmental Defense Fund and FAIR, we were able to provide input on what we see as a really strong proposed rule from this agency in the past few months. Wespath actually publicly submitted a comment letter to this agency in support of these new rules on methane leaks. And this is the most significant modernization of these rules around natural gas pipeline leaks in decades. It's the first big update in that policy, despite 15 years of really big oil and gas growth in the US since the fracking boom started. It's also going to help prevent accidents like the Big Cowboy pipeline leak in 2021, which released 5,000 cars worth of annual emissions in just an hour. That was one of those super emitter events that I mentioned earlier. There's also been some interesting policy developments here too that came around the recent COP28 climate summit, with the UK setting new standards around methane for gas that it imports, and a joint agreement between China and the US on reducing methane. And all this complements the other systemic engagement work we're doing through the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. We've got a few examples of the thought leadership that we're contributing to through the Alliance up here on this slide. This work is really aligned with the policy engagement that we've talked about.
So Lucas, well, I imagine we still have a lot of work to do. It sounds like there's been a lot of progress, which I'm sure is encouraging. I think it's great to see momentum on issues like this where there's been such a clear connection to both long-term sustainability, but also the short-term business imperatives. Is there any final thoughts before we wrap up today?
Sure. It's just like you're saying. It's those clear connections. Reducing methane is one of those low-hanging fruits where we've got the technological advancements to implement solutions right now. And because methane is such an important and potent greenhouse gas, extracting and shipping it more responsibly is one of the best steps we can take that could have a meaningful impact on our climate in the near term. It's also a great example of where, even in a politically divided environment, long-term investors and smart engineers and oil and gas field workers can come together to implement practical solutions in a win-win way.
Great. Thanks for that wonderful update, Lucas.
Thank you, Joe.